At first glance, the Taiwan Strait looks calm on a map, a thin blue channel barely 130 kilometers wide. But behind that narrow strip of water sit three converging forces. A rising China that calls Taiwan a core interest for national rejuvenation, a besieged democracy that refuses to accept annexation, and a United States alliance network struggling to deter war without starting one. The question is no longer whether this stretch of sea matters. It is how a clash here could reshape the entire Pacific system in a matter of days. Imagine this scenario. One winter morning, merchant captains approaching Taiwan receive urgent navigation warnings. Large exclusion zones are suddenly declared for live fire exercises. Chinese warships appear on radar along multiple axes. Satellite imagery shows ballistic missile brigades rolling into pre-surveyed positions on the mainland coast. In Taipei, air raid sirens test for the first time in years, while stock exchanges from Tokyo to New York watch semiconductor futures plunge. Is this just another pressure drill? Or is it the opening act of what historians might later call the Pacific Storm? The idea that such a showdown is possible is no longer abstract theory. Over the past decade, the People's Liberation Army has rehearsed blockade and strike scenarios around Taiwan with increasing scale and sophistication. In 2022 and again in 2023, the PLA's Eastern Theater Command conducted joint air, naval, and missile drills that bracketed the island and fired ballistic missiles over Taiwanese territory. In late 2025, China went further with justice mission exercises that simulated a multi-day blockade of major Taiwanese ports using dozens of warships, aircraft, and missiles. The message to both Taipei and Washington was blunt. Beijing now has the tools to threaten an encirclement of the island at will. Why does this matter for everyone else? Because a Taiwan Strait crisis is not just a local military problem. It is a systemic shock to global trade, technology, and alliance credibility. Around half of the world's container fleet by tonnage passes through these waters each year. Taiwan's foundries manufacture a dominant share of the most advanced semiconductors used in everything from smartphones to fighter jets. If shipping is disrupted or chip production is crippled, the effects would cascade from factory floors in Germany to data centers in California. The Pacific Storm would not stay in the Pacific. There is also a psychological dimension that cannot be ignored. For Beijing's success in coercing or conquering Taiwan would signal that the regional security order built under American primacy is brittle and reversible. For Washington, failure to help defend the island after decades of rhetorical commitment would undermine confidence among allies from Japan to the Philippines. For middle powers in Southeast Asia, the outcome would force hard recalculations about hedging between China and the United States. So when analysts speak about a showdown in the Taiwan Strait, they are really talking about a test of two visions of regional order. To understand how this storm could form, we need to step back and map the strategic weather patterns that have been building for years. Who are the principal actors? What do they want? What tools do they have? And which miscalculations could pull them across the threshold from relentless pressure to open war? Only by dissecting those questions can we turn a dramatic phrase like Taiwan Strait Showdown into a concrete analytical framework rather than a cinematic slogan. The first layer of context is political and ideological. For the leadership of the People's Republic of China, Taiwan is not a distant territory. It is framed as an unfinished chapter of the Civil War and a symbol of national humiliation by foreign powers. Chinese white papers and speeches by Xi Jinping describe unification as essential to the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and explicitly refuse to rule out the use of force. In this narrative, any permanent separation or formal independence is portrayed as an intolerable loss of sovereignty. That framing filters directly into PLA planning and into Chinese public expectations about how far Beijing should be willing to go. On the other side of the strait, Taiwan has consolidated a vibrant multi-party democracy with its own identity and institutions. Most polls show a large majority of citizens prefer the status quo of de facto independence with strong international ties over any attempt at rapid unification under Beijing's system. This is especially true among younger generations who grew up without direct experience of rule from the mainland. Elections routinely feature sharp debates about how to manage the risk from China. Yet even parties seen as more open to dialogue stop short of endorsing Beijing's one country, two systems model, which has lost credibility after developments in Hong Kong. The United States sits in the middle of this equation with a posture of deliberate ambiguity. The Taiwan Relations Act obliges Washington to provide weapons of a defensive character and to maintain the capacity to resist coercion, but it does not promise automatic military intervention. Over time, bipartisan concern about China's military rise has pushed successive U.S. administrations to upgrade arms sales to Taiwan, conduct high-profile freedom of navigation operations, and deepen coordination with allies. Recent years have seen large packages of long-range rockets, drones, and coastal defense missiles approved for Taipei. Allies and adversaries alike watch these moves for clues about how much risk Washington is truly prepared to run. Around this triangle of Beijing, Taipei, and Washington, a web of regional actors makes calculations of its own. Japan has published a new national security strategy explicitly calling stability in the Taiwan Strait indispensable for its own security, and has begun acquiring long-range counterstrike missiles that can reach Chinese coastal areas. Tokyo has also drafted evacuation plans for over 100,000 civilians living on remote islands close to Taiwan, a clear signal that it expects any conflict to spill into Japanese territory almost immediately. The Philippines has expanded U.S. access to bases that overlook the Bashi Channel south of Taiwan, highlighting Manila's fear that a Chinese move on Taiwan would also threaten its maritime claims. From this broader context, we can already see one source of danger. Each side believes it is acting defensively in protection of vital interests. Beijing frames its military buildup and gray zone pressure as a response to separatism and U.S. interference. Taipei views its rearmament and deepening ties with Washington as essential just to survive. Washington and its allies see forward deployments as necessary to reassure partners and deter a revisionist power. The problem is that when every actor calls its moves defensive, the net effect can still be a classic security dilemma. One side's deterrence posture looks like preparation for offensive war to the other. This strategic backdrop has produced a new normal of almost continuous friction. Chinese warplanes cross the median line of the Taiwan Strait or enter Taiwan's air defense identification zone on a near-daily basis to signal dominance and wear down Taiwanese readiness. PLA Navy task groups and Coast Guard vessels probe around Taiwanese outlying islands and along critical sea lanes. Taiwan responds with intercepts, mobilization drills, and highly publicized tests of its own missile forces. The United States rallies allies for multilateral exercises that rehearse air and naval coordination in scenarios that look very much like Taiwan contingencies. The danger is that within this high-paced environment, the step from demonstration to escalation shrinks. A second source of risk lies in domestic politics. Chinese leaders must balance deterrence against international backlash and economic costs. Yet shrill nationalist rhetoric and a narrative of historical grievance can narrow their room for compromise. Taiwanese leaders, meanwhile, must answer to voters who demand both security and dignity. They cannot easily accept any formula that looks like capitulation. U.S. administrations face their own constraints in Congress and public opinion. No one wants to be seen as losing Taiwan. That domestic lens makes it harder for any side to back down in a crisis. It also shapes how intelligence and military plans are prepared long before the first missile is ever launched. With the political context in view, we can now move to the hard military balance. Any serious look at a Taiwan Strait showdown begins with the People's Liberation Army, which has spent decades preparing for what it calls joint firepower strike and joint island landing operations. According to recent U.S. defense assessments, China now fields the world's largest standing military, along with the largest navy by ship numbers, and one of the most formidable inventories of precision ballistic and cruise missiles on the planet. The Eastern Theater Command, headquartered in Nanjing, is the focal point for operations against Taiwan. The first tool in Beijing's kit is the PLA rocket force. Short-range ballistic missiles such as the DF-11, DF-15, and DF-16 can hit targets across Taiwan with flight times measured in minutes. Open sources citing U.S. reports suggest roughly 900 such short-range missiles are assigned to the Taiwan theater, supported by around 300 mobile launchers. These are complemented by medium-range systems like the DF-21 and DF-26, which can threaten U.S. air bases in Okinawa and Guam, depending on variant. In a showdown, these missiles would be used for saturation strikes on airfields, radar nodes, command centers, and key infrastructure to blind and paralyze Taiwanese defenses while holding U.S. forces at risk if they intervene. The second pillar is air power. Across its Eastern and Southern theater commands, the PLA Air Force and PLA Navy Aviation together field on the order of 950 fighters and roughly 300 bombers and attack aircraft that could be committed against Taiwan. This mix includes modern fourth-plus-generation jets like the J-10C, J-16, and the carrier-capable J-15, as well as growing numbers of stealthy J-20 fighters. Supported by large airborne early warning aircraft, electronic warfare platforms, and tankers, these forces are designed to overwhelm Taiwan's much smaller air force and impose local air superiority at critical points and times. The third pillar is amphibious and naval power. The PLA Navy now deploys multiple large-deck amphibious assault ships of the Type 075 class and a fleet of Type 071 amphibious transport docks, each displacing around 25,000 tons and capable of carrying hundreds of troops along with landing craft and helicopters. These high-end platforms augment numerous smaller tank landing ships, civilian roll-on, roll-off ferries, and auxiliary vessels that could be pressed into service. Escorting them are modern destroyers and frigates, including Type 055 cruisers with powerful area air defense systems. Submarines lurk below. In combination, they provide the sea legs for any large-scale landing attempt and the muscle to enforce a blockade. Facing this is Taiwan's much smaller yet still significant force structure. The Republic of China Armed Forces maintain around 150 to 230,000 active personnel, depending on classification and mobilization, of up to roughly 1.6 million reservists in wartime. Taipei has extended conscription back to 1 year and is experimenting with more intensive reserve training in recognition that manpower must be rapidly scalable for any prolonged defense. The island's geography, with its rugged mountains and limited suitable landing beaches, allows infantry reserves armed with anti-tank weapons and mines to be more than mere numbers on paper. In the air and missile domain, Taiwan cannot match China system for system, so it emphasizes smart defense. The island fields a mix of U.S.-supplied Patriot PAC-2 and PAC-3 batteries and indigenous Tiancong surface-to-air missiles, forming layered coverage against aircraft and some types of ballistic threat. Its air force centers on upgraded F-16V fighters, supported by locally built fighters and trainers. On the offensive side, Taiwan deploys Xiongfeng series anti-ship missiles, and is acquiring large numbers of U.S. Harpoon missiles, along with mobile rocket artillery such as HIMARS and loitering munitions. Recent reforms also emphasize drones, with plans for thousands of reconnaissance and strike systems inspired by lessons from Ukraine. Overlaying this local balance are U.S. and allied forces that would shape any extended showdown, even if they enter gradually. The United States maintains powerful air and naval assets in Japan, Guam, Hawaii, and increasingly the Philippines. Carrier strike groups armed with F-35 fighters and long-range anti-ship missiles could threaten PLA naval formations from beyond coastal defenses. Attack submarines would be especially dangerous for Chinese amphibious convoys. The U.S. Marine Corps is reorganizing into Marine Littoral Regiments designed to operate small units with anti-ship missiles from dispersed islands in the first island chain, including Okinawa. Whether these forces would be committed and at what stage is a political question, but their potential impact strongly influences Chinese and Taiwanese planning. Japan is also no longer a passive bystander. Its new security strategy envisions acquiring hundreds of standoff missiles and strengthening defenses in its southwestern islands that sit on the sea lines around Taiwan. Tokyo is building underground shelters and surface-to-air missile sites on islands like Yonaguni, only a short distance from Taiwan's east coast, and has begun planning evacuations for civilians in any cross-strait conflict. In practical terms, this means any large Chinese operation risks drawing Japan into the fight directly if Japanese territory or bases are attacked. That prospect, in turn, ensures that the entire U.S.-Japan alliance would be engaged. Taken together, the balance of forces looks daunting for Taiwan at first glance. China enjoys numerical superiority in almost every category and has geographic advantage for launching missile and airstrikes from its mainland. Yet raw numbers are only part of the story. Amphibious operations over contested waters are notoriously difficult. Taiwan's rugged terrain favors defense. U.S. and allied assets introduce powerful wild cards. The true question is less about static inventories and more about time. Who can achieve their operational objectives fast enough before the political and economic pressures of war become unbearable? To explore that question, we need to dive into tactics and weapons in more detail. Beijing has a menu of military options short of an all-out invasion, ranging from coercive drills to a protracted blockade. At the high end of the spectrum lie campaigns designed to quickly shatter Taiwanese resistance and present the world with a fait accompli before outside forces can respond decisively. Each option relies on different combinations of firepower, mobility, and information warfare, and each carries distinct risks. One prominent concept is the Joint Firepower Strike Campaign. In this scenario, China launches massed waves of ballistic and cruise missiles combined with air and cyber attacks to paralyze Taiwan's command networks and destroy critical military infrastructure in the first 48 to 72 hours. Short-range ballistic missiles target air bases, hardened shelters, and fuel depots. Cruise missiles and stealth aircraft hit air defense radars and communications hubs. At the same time, cyber units attempt to disrupt power grids, banking systems, and media platforms to sow confusion. The goal is not simply physical destruction, but systemic shock that leaves Taiwanese leaders struggling to form an accurate picture of the battlefield. Taiwan's counter is a strategy sometimes summarized as asymmetric defense, or an overall defense concept. Rather than trying to match China plane for plane or ship for ship, Taiwanese planners emphasize survivability dispersion and the ability to strike back with many small mobile systems. Air defense units practice rapid shoot-and-scoot tactics. Mobile missile launchers hide in underground facilities, civil tunnels, and hardened shelters, then emerge briefly to fire salvos before relocating. Small, fast missile boats and mine layers use the island's coastal geography and civilian harbors to complicate PLA targeting. In cyber and electronic warfare, Taiwan aims to keep enough connectivity alive through redundant networks and hardened nodes to maintain a coherent defense even under intense attack. A second major operational concept is blockade. China can attempt various forms ranging from a partial or quarantine-style operation focused on specific cargoes to a full kinetic blockade, in which warships, aircraft, submarines, and mines attempt to stop all traffic into and out of Taiwan. Analysts note that recent PLA drills, including Justice Mission, have rehearsed encirclement patterns with warships and aircraft operating in multiple zones around the island. A mining blockade using submarines and aircraft delivered sea mines at key approaches could severely slow commercial shipping even without dramatic naval battles. China might bet that prolonged economic strangulation would fracture Taiwanese political will while staying below the threshold of attacking U.S. forces directly. Yet blockade is not a one-sided game. Taiwan can respond with its own mine warfare to complicate PLA naval operations, exploiting narrow choke points and shallow waters where Chinese ships are most vulnerable. Coastal defense missiles like Harpoon and Xiongfeng, backed by drones and maritime patrol aircraft, can turn the near seas into a kill zone for any Chinese vessel that ventures too close. U.S. and allied navies could choose to challenge a blockade diplomatically or physically, by organizing escorted convoys or by threatening reciprocal sanctions on Chinese shipping elsewhere. Even if Washington avoids direct kinetic engagement at first, its submarine fleet and long-range air power create constant uncertainty for Chinese planners about how far they can escalate without inviting devastating counterstrikes. The most complex and risky course of action for Beijing is a full-scale amphibious invasion aimed at seizing key ports and ultimately occupying the island. Amphibious operations combine naval convoy protection, beach landings, heli-borne assaults, and urban warfare. They require precise coordination across services and careful timing around tides, weather, and moonlight. The Taiwan Strait is notorious for strong currents, seasonal typhoons, and winter storms that can disrupt operations. Large ships like Type 071 and Type 075 amphibious vessels offer impressive lift and aviation capacity. Yet they are also high-value targets that cannot hide easily from satellites and maritime surveillance. In this context, individual weapons systems take on strategic meaning. Anti-ship ballistic missiles such as the DF-21D and DF-26 are designed to push U.S. carrier strike groups away from the first island chain. If they work as advertised, they could complicate U.S. efforts to project air power near Taiwan. On the other side, long-range U.S. and allied missiles like JASSM, ERLRASM, and upgraded Japanese Type 12 systems are intended to put Chinese surface fleets at risk from distant launch platforms. The contest between these strike complexes becomes a duel of sensors networks and electronic warfare as much as of missiles themselves. Drones and uncrewed systems add yet another layer. Taiwan is building new drone units in both its army and navy, integrating aerial and sea drones for reconnaissance and attack missions. Swarms of cheap, expendable drones could spot for artillery, harass amphibious staging areas, or overwhelm point defenses on individual ships. China, for its part, has invested heavily in reconnaissance strike complexes that pair satellites over the Western Pacific with high-altitude drones and underwater sensors. In a showdown, whoever better fuses this sensor data into actionable targeting information while denying it to the opponent will enjoy a major advantage. All of this means that a Taiwan Strait showdown would not resemble the relatively clean front lines of past wars. It would be a multi-domain contest where missiles cross paths with other missiles in the dark, then are followed by drones, jamming beams, and cyber worms. It would be fought as much in the electromagnetic spectrum and in server farms as on beaches and city streets. The weapon systems are important, but the real decisive factor is how each side orchestrates them into a coherent concept of operations under the pressure of real-time combat losses. With those capabilities and tactics in mind, we can now sketch how a Pacific storm might actually unfold. The precise trigger is unknowable. It could begin with a political crisis over a referendum, a collision at sea, an accidental shoot-down, or a deliberate attempt by Beijing to force unification on its own timetable. But most plausible pathways share several common phases. An intense, pre-crisis gray zone campaign, a sudden lurch into overt military moves, a race between shock and resilience. In the run-up to open conflict, Beijing would likely increase pressure gradually. More frequent air and naval incursions across the median line, customs inspections that delay or turn back Taiwan-bound shipping, large-scale cyber intrusions targeting critical infrastructure under the guise of criminal or patriotic hacking, disinformation campaigns amplifying fears about economic collapse and questioning the competence of Taiwan's government. From Beijing's perspective, such moves probe for weaknesses and test international reactions while staying below the threshold that would justify a robust foreign military response. The transition from coercion to kinetic conflict would probably be marked by a fast-moving crisis, perhaps a Chinese exercise that suddenly expands into a no-sail zone encircling the island, perhaps a Taiwanese decision to intercept and board a suspicious vessel near an outlying island, followed by exchange of fire, perhaps a domestic event in China that leads leaders to see a need to rally nationalist support. Whatever the proximate cause, once the decision is made, PLA commands would try to seize the initiative through shock. Missile brigades and air wings would execute pre-planned packages. Cyber units would flip dormant malware into active attacks on communications and power. Naval forces would move to close key choke points. On Day 1 and Day 2, the main question would be whether Taiwan's military and political leadership remain coherent under the initial blow. If air bases and command centers are devastated and communication with reserves breaks down, panic could spread. If, however, enough hardened facilities survive and redundant command links hold, Taiwan could begin implementing its playbook. Mobile surface-to-air missile batteries would emerge briefly to engage PLA aircraft before relocating. Harpoon launchers and Xiongfeng batteries would target any Chinese surface ships within range. Drones would lift off from hidden sites to spot and harass enemy formations. Civil defense organizations would move civilians into shelters and begin damage control. Meanwhile, foreign capitals would confront the decision of how quickly and how overtly to intervene. The United States might initially focus on intelligence-sharing air and missile defense support and cyber operations against PLA networks, while surging submarines and stealth aircraft toward the theater. Carrier groups would maneuver to positions that allow them to threaten Chinese forces while staying at standoff distances from mainland-based missiles. Japan would raise alert levels throughout its self-defense forces, activate evacuation plans for its southwestern islands, and prepare to defend its own airspace and sea lanes. Australia and other partners could contribute surveillance tankers and long-range missiles. If China opts for blockade rather than immediate invasion, the confrontation could extend into weeks. Insurance rates for shipping would spike. Some companies would reroute around the strait at enormous cost, while others would risk running the blockade. China might selectively allow some cargoes while stopping others in an attempt to peel off international support for Taiwan. The United States and allies would debate whether to organize escorted convoys or to respond asymmetrically by tightening restrictions on Chinese trade elsewhere and on access to critical technologies. The economic pain would be severe on all sides long before a single beach is contested. If Beijing chooses to attempt a landing, the tempo would change again. Waves of amphibious shipping would move toward selected beaches, preceded by intense bombardment and helicopter assaults. But here, the defenders' advantages sharpen. Taiwan would likely concentrate artillery drones, mines, and anti-tank teams on the most accessible landing zones, turning them into attrition traps. Urban combat in coastal cities would be brutal and costly. If U.S. and allied forces decide to actively target amphibious convoys with submarines, long-range missiles, and airstrikes, Chinese losses could mount rapidly. The central question then becomes political. How many casualties and how much economic devastation are leaders in Beijing and Taipei willing to endure before seeking a frozen conflict or negotiated endgame? From such a grim scenario, several strategic lessons emerge that matter not only for the actors directly involved, but for military planners worldwide. The first is the centrality of time and tempo in modern great power conflict. China's advantage lies in proximity and mass. Taiwan's and the Allies' advantage lies in resilience over time and in broader economic and diplomatic leverage. If Beijing can achieve its objectives in days, it may present the world with a fait accompli. If the conflict drags into weeks and months, China would confront escalating sanctions, supply chain disruptions, and the possibility of coalition military pressure that could outstrip its initial gains. A second lesson is that mass in the missile and drone era looks different from past wars. Traditional measures like number of tanks or ships are no longer adequate proxies for combat power. The side that can generate sustained salvos of precision munitions while protecting its own sensor networks will likely dominate. That pushes militaries towards stockpiling large quantities of relatively cheap smart weapons and building robust production capacity. Taiwan's focus on numerous mobile missile launchers, drones, and mines reflects this logic. The same reasoning underlies U.S. and Japanese investments in standoff missiles that can be launched from dispersed platforms. Third, there is the importance of societal resilience. Taiwan cannot outbuild China's arsenal, but it can strengthen the ability of its society to absorb shocks and continue functioning under attack. That includes hardening critical infrastructure, building redundancy into power and communications networks, decentralizing supply stocks, and training civilians for civil defense. It also means countering disinformation and maintaining public confidence so that panic and defeatism do not spread faster than missiles. The evolution of Taiwan's reserve and mobilization system, however incomplete, shows recognition that modern defense is a whole-of-society effort rather than a task for professional soldiers alone. A fourth lesson concerns alliances and posture. Deterrence depends not only on capabilities, but on credible plans and political will. U.S. force posture in the Indo-Pacific is gradually shifting to a more distributed model, with greater use of small forward bases in the first and second island chains and closer operational integration with allies such as Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. Japan's decision to acquire counterstrike capabilities and fortify its southwestern islands marks a historic departure from past self-imposed limits and sends a strong signal that it views a Taiwan contingency as integral to its own defense. These moves complicate Chinese planning, but they also require careful crisis management to avoid accidental escalation. Finally, information integrity is a critical domain. In any Taiwan Strait showdown, all sides will wage an intense narrative battle. Beijing will likely portray its actions as internal policing against separatism and blame foreign interference. Taipei will emphasize self-determination and depict itself as a frontline democracy under assault. Washington and its allies will frame the conflict in terms of the rules-based order and freedom of navigation. Each side will use cyber tools, social media, and state media to shape domestic and international opinion. For military planners, this creates an additional operational requirement. Protecting decision-makers from information overload, manipulation, and panic is as vital as protecting runways from missile strikes. So where does this leave us when we talk about a Taiwan Strait showdown and the coming Pacific storm? Are we looking at an inevitability or at a dangerous yet avoidable scenario? The answer depends on both structural forces and human choices. Structurally, the trends are worrisome. China's military modernization and increasingly coercive posture around Taiwan are real. Taiwan's moves toward a more distinct political identity and away from Beijing's preferred formulas are also real. U.S. and allied efforts to counterbalance China through new defense concepts and posture adjustments add friction. These currents create the storm system. Yet storms do not automatically strike. They follow paths influenced by initial conditions, small perturbations, and the decisions of pilots steering through them. In political terms, that means there is still space for deterrence and crisis management. Beijing can calibrate its exercises and rhetoric to avoid locking itself into a timeline for forceful unification. Taipei can continue strengthening its defenses while avoiding symbolic moves that appear to declare legal independence. Washington and its allies can build military resilience without framing every step as part of an inevitable confrontation. Dialogue and crisis hotlines may sound modest compared to carrier groups, but they matter when minutes count. At the same time, prudence requires assuming that deterrence might fail. That is why detailed scenario analysis remains essential. Militaries need to test plans against harsh assumptions. What if missile defenses are less effective than advertised? What if cyber attacks knock out more infrastructure than expected? What if allies hesitate, or domestic politics in one capital suddenly shifts? Exercises and war games are tools to uncover hidden vulnerabilities before they are exposed in combat. The recent focus within Taiwan on asymmetric capabilities and within the U.S.-Japan alliance on integrated joint operations around the first island chain reflects lessons from such analyses. For the rest of the world, the core takeaway is stark. A conflict in the Taiwan Strait would not be a distant regional skirmish. It would be a global shock, with military, economic, and technological consequences that reverberate for decades. That is why policymakers from Europe to Southeast Asia now include Taiwan scenarios in their strategic planning. They have to consider supply chain resilience, diversification of semiconductor production, and the future of international law on blockades and sanctions. In that sense, the Pacific Storm is already shaping behavior even before the first real shots are fired. Looking ahead, the most responsible course is a dual-track approach. On one track, strengthen the capacity of Taiwan and its partners to make aggression clearly too costly to contemplate. That means more resilient defenses, smarter weapons stockpiles, and tighter allied coordination. On the other track, keep diplomatic channels open and invest in crisis communication mechanisms that reduce the risk of miscalculation. Neither track offers guarantees, but together they provide the best chance that the Taiwan Strait remains a tense yet peaceful flashpoint rather than the epicenter of a 21st-century great power war.